The silk of her borrowed gown felt like a shroud, but it was the cold iron of the Duke's grip that truly told Clara Vance she had finally been caught. She did not move. She had learned, in 2 years of surviving the kind of London that polite society pretends does not exist, that stillness was its own weapon. She stood against the pillar and felt the marble at her back and breathed in, out, in again. The candles in Lady Danbury's ballroom were burning low, the wax having long since run down the silver holders in pale, waxy tears that nobody had bothered to wipe clean. The music had stopped a full 30 seconds ago, long enough for every head in that glittering, suffocating room to turn. She could see the lace fans rising. She could see the whispers beginning, passing from mouth to painted ear like a contagion. She was still holding the watch. She had had 100 chances to drop it, to slip it into a pocket, to press it into a footman's hand and walk briskly toward the servant's door. And yet here it was, clutched so tightly in her bare fingers that the tarnished casing had left a red crescent pressed into her palm. She was holding it the way a drowning person holds a rope, because it was Arthur's, because it had always been Arthur's, and because in 2 years of having nothing, she had allowed herself exactly one object of the past. And she was not letting go of it in front of a ballroom full of people who had never deserved to understand why. The Duke's face was very close to hers, too close. The expression on it was not what she had expected. She had braced herself for the cold, efficient rage of a man who has just found a thief in the middle of a society ball. What she had not prepared for was the look beneath the fury, the thing underneath the iron control that she could see clearly because she had spent 2 years learning to read faces for what they did not say. He looked, beneath everything else, like a man who had just seen a ghost. He looked at her with ferocity and something terribly close to relief. Welcome back to Whispered Thrones, where the forgotten corners of history hold the deepest truths of the heart. If you find solace in stories of quiet strength, dignity against the odds, and love that weathers the harshest storms, please take a moment to subscribe and join our community of listeners. Your presence here honors the journeys we share. Now, close your eyes, breathe in the scent of rain on old stone, and let me take you back to where this began, to a freezing attic in the slums of St. Giles 3 days before a duke crossed the threshold of the damned. The cold had a particular character in St. Giles. It was not the clean, sharp cold of the countryside that Clara had grown up with, that honest cold that stung your cheeks in the churchyard and made frost patterns on the window panes look like lace. The cold in St. Giles was wet and grey and penetrating, the kind that smelled of tallow and open drains, and too many bodies pressed too close together without enough food between them. It got into your bones in September, and did not leave until April, if it left at all. Clara's attic room was at the top of a narrow building on Short's Gardens, above a cobbler who worked through the night, and a family of 7, who argued with the reliable fury of the genuinely desperate. The room cost 4 shillings a week. The window had been broken since October, and she had stuffed the gap with a piece of burlap that did approximately nothing. There was a straw mat on the floor, a 3-legged stool, a bucket, and a small tin box under a loose board where she kept her money, and a broken piece of tailor's chalk. Every night before she slept, she took out the chalk. She wrote the numbers on the floorboards by the light of whatever candle stub she had scavenged. Regiment numbers, dates, names of officers. Every detail of Arthur's last deployment she could still hold in memory. Because she was terrified that grief would eventually blur the facts she needed to be true. She wrote them carefully, precisely, in her most deliberate hand. And every morning before the landlord banged on the door about the rent, she wiped them away with the hem of her skirt, leaving only the faintest pale residue in the wood grain that nobody would ever think to look for. She did this because if she stopped doing it, She was afraid she would stop believing there was anything left to fight for. Clara Vance had been, until the age of 20, the contented daughter of a country rector in Wiltshire. Her father was a gentle, learned man who kept bees and annotated his theology books in tiny script. Her brother Arthur had been 4 years her senior, broad-shouldered and laughing, the kind of young man who swung you around the kitchen when he came home on leave until the cook scolded you both. He had gone into the infantry at 18 because he believed in the right thing. It had been his greatest quality. In the end, it had been the quality that destroyed him. 2 years ago, a letter had arrived from the War Office. Arthur Vance, it said in the bloodless language of bureaucracy, had been found in possession of documents pertaining to British troop movements, and had been charged posthumously with treason against the Crown. Their family estate and all assets were to be seized in partial restitution. Clara's father read the letter, standing at his study window. He did not move for a long time afterward. He died 4 months later of what the physician called a failure of the heart, and which Clara understood to be a failure of the will to continue. She buried him in the churchyard where he had buried everyone else for 30 years, gathered what she could carry, and walked away from the only home she had ever known. She did not go to the workhouse. She came to London because London was vast enough to disappear into, and disappearing was what she needed to do. Away from a creditor named Greer, one of her father's men, who had made it very clear before the body was cold that he had a solution for Clara's financial situation that involved his private rooms and her compliance. She had left Wiltshire 3 days before he came to collect. In London she worked wherever she could, sewing piecework until the foreman's hands became a problem, laundry work until her skin cracked and bled. Each door closing, each month bringing her further down, until she arrived where she was now. 4 shillings a week for a broken window and a straw mat and a hidden piece of chalk. She had developed other skills along the way. The pickpocketing had begun by accident, grown by necessity, and sharpened by practice into something efficient and mostly invisible. She had a code: never women, never the poor, never anyone for whom the loss would truly hurt. She took from heavy watch chains and distracted expressions, felt the moral weight of it every single night, and did it anyway, because the alternative was to stop existing. She was good at it because she was invisible in the way the fallen are always invisible to the comfortable, present but unindividuated, familiar in outline, never examined closely enough to matter. And then she had cut the watch chain of the Duke of Stirling, and everything had changed. Now, if you have found something of your own heart in Clara's quiet, furious endurance, I hope you will take a moment to subscribe before I go on, because this is the part where the story begins to move, and I want you with us for all of it. Julian Vance, the Duke of Stirling, was 29 years old, and he had the particular stillness of men accustomed to having rooms adjust to their presence. He was not handsome in the easy way that made women comfortable. He was handsome, the way a drawn sword is handsome, with a purposeful severity that made most people take half a step back before they had consciously decided to do so. He had carried his title since 23 with the focused intensity of a man who understands that power is not an inheritance but a continuous performance of will. He sat on War Office committees at the highest level. He had the kind of social leverage that ended careers with a single well-placed silence in the right drawing room. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man Clara Vance had spent 2 years teaching herself not to be afraid of. She would not have entirely succeeded. That Tuesday morning, 4 hours before the Covent Garden encounter, Julian was in a War Office dealing with a supply contractor named Aldridge, who had been skimming from army contracts for 3 years. Julian listened to 11 minutes of explanation about accounting irregularities and shipping delays. Then he said, very quietly, that the witnesses had been identified, and that Aldridge would resign his contract by the end of the week, or explain the same figures to a parliamentary committee. He said it without raising his voice. Aldridge went pale and left. Julian sat for a moment after the door closed, looking at nothing. He had been searching for Arthur Vance's sister for 2 years. He had spent £400 a year on a private investigator and monthly pension payments to what he believed was her address in Somerset, receiving confirmation reports in return, and the quiet assurance that Clara Vance was, if not flourishing, surviving. He did not know that every one of those reports had been fabricated. He did not know the money had never reached her. He did not know she was writing numbers on floorboards 3 miles away. The weight of things we do not know is extraordinary. It presses down on us and we feel it as something else. As guilt, as unease, as the persistent sense that something in our careful accounting does not add up. And we do not understand what it is until the thing we did not know walks directly into our line of sight with bright, furious eyes and a hidden blade, and takes something from us that we cannot replace. It was raining the way it only rains in London in October, less like weather and more like the city's permanent condition finally achieving full expression. The elite of the ton were exiting the Covent Garden Theatre into their carriages with the frantic dignity of people who refuse to run despite being soaked, and the impoverished were pressed under the awnings, selling orange peels and small, desperate services to anyone who paused long enough to be sold to. Clara was under the far end of the awning because visibility was something she avoided on principle. She had 4 shillings and 3 pennies to her name. The rent was due Thursday, and the landlord had a habit of making his displeasure physical. She was watching the exits with the practiced patience of someone trained to look as though they are doing nothing at all, when a small boy, barefoot and clutching roasted chestnuts in a scrap of paper, made the mistake of approaching one of the carriages too directly. Lord George Vance, the Duke's cousin, coming down the theatre steps, had a coachman's whip in his hand, taken from the driver to demonstrate something amusing. He used it now, not hard but not gently, to sweep the boy out of his path. The boy stumbled, the chestnuts scattered. Clara moved without deciding to. She caught the boy, pulled him upright, and said something to the coachman, too quietly for anyone further away to hear. Something precise. In the accent she usually suppressed because it was too educated and too obviously wrong for the woman she was pretending to be. From above and to her left, a very slight sound. She looked up. Julian Vance was on the carriage step, a greatcoat so dark it was almost black, rain running from the brim of his hat, and he was looking down at her, not with the mild distaste the wealthy usually offered the poor, not with the blank non-recognition she relied on. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a word right at the edge of memory, a word they can feel but cannot quite retrieve. The recognition hit Clara in the chest like a stone dropped into still water. The hawk, the sterling hawk on the carriage door, gold on navy, exactly as Arthur had described it in his letters. "This is my commanding officer's crest," Arthur had written once. "The most infuriating man I have ever had the misfortune to respect." She had never met Julian Vance, but she had Arthur's descriptions. His small drawings in letter margins, and 2 years of fixing the image of the man she blamed for her brother's fate in her mind, with the focused intensity of someone sharpening a knife. She knew the jaw. She knew the eyes. She knew he was 1 step closer to recognizing her than she was comfortable with. Her hand moved. The hidden tailor's blade, ground down from a broken shears honed on alley cobblestones until it was thin as a whisper, sliced through the gold fob chain in the 1/2 second when Julian glanced back at the boy. Then she was gone, into the fog, into the crowd, into the particular darkness of the streets that she knew, and he did not. She ran 2 blocks before she looked at what she had taken. A gold seal, a small enamelled pin, and a tarnished silver pocket watch, old and dented and worn smooth from years of handling. She opened the back cover with shaking fingers. Not Julian's name inside. Not Julian's initials. 2 lines scratched in the clumsy hand of someone doing their own engraving with a pocket knife, AV. And below it, the date of Arthur's first commission. She stood in the alley behind the 7 dials, and held her brother's watch in both hands, and breathed through the thing that moved through her chest, which was too large and too complicated to have a simple name. After a while, she closed her fingers around it and kept walking. He found her in 2 days. Julian arrived at Short's Gardens on a Thursday morning, the landlord already at her door. The door came open. The landlord stumbled backward. Julian stood in the frame with the landlord's wrist in one hand and his card in the other, said 4 words in a voice that made the man go still, and then stepped inside and closed the door. He looked at the room, the straw mat, the broken window, the tin box she had moved herself in front of without realizing she was doing it. His jaw tightened, and he looked away briefly, then back. He told her what he knew. He told her he could have her arrested. She told him to go ahead. Then he told her the other option. His Hertfordshire estate, the identity of Miss Clara West, a distant connection of a deceased family friend, a warm room, and 3 meals in exchange for her presence until he could resolve a situation he was not yet prepared to explain. She said, "And what do you get from this arrangement, Your Grace?" he said. "The peace of mind of not having to wonder where you are." It was not the answer she had expected. She filed it away with the other things she did not yet understand, picked up the tin box, and walked out of Short's Gardens for the last time with her head as upright as she had ever held it. She wore Arthur's watch on a ribbon around her neck, against her sternum, and she did not mention it. She climbed into his carriage, already planning how to use her time under his roof to prove he had betrayed her brother. She had never been wrong about anything more thoroughly in her life. At the Hertfordshire estate, she watched Julian from across rooms with the careful, cataloguing attention she had trained on survival. He was harder to hate at close range. He was not warm, she would not have said that, but he was just. His treatment of his servants was precise and respectful in a way that was not common. He listened to the whole of a dispute before he spoke. He did not perform authority. He simply exercised it, and there was a difference, and she was too honest not to notice it. On the 10th night, when the house was dark and the servants retired, she lit a candle and went to his study. She had been telling herself she was looking for evidence against him. The campaign desk was mahogany, army-issued and maintained with care. Clara ran her hands along the underside of the upper drawer and felt the catch. The hidden compartment held a bundle of letters and 2 leather-bound journals tied with cord. She held the first letter to her candle and recognized the handwriting before she read a single word. She sat down on the floor. She read for 2 hours. The candle burned to a stub and she tilted the pages closer and closer to the dying flame, and she did not stop. Because what Arthur's letters contained, written in his careful, slightly slanted hand, was not a traitor's correspondence. It was the correspondence of a man who had spent 3 years walking deliberately toward his own death in service of something he believed mattered. Arthur had been a double agent, Julian's double agent, placed within a network of corrupt supply officers to identify the intelligence leak that had been getting soldiers killed. The operation was classified at the highest level. Arthur had understood from the beginning that if he was discovered, there would be no acknowledgement, no rescue, no defense. The letters were Arthur's record, sent to Julian through a private courier, because Arthur had understood that the record needed to exist somewhere, even if it could never be used. The last letter was dated 3 weeks before Arthur died. A postscript had been added in a slightly less steady hand, which meant Arthur had come back to it after writing the main text. The postscript said, "If anything happens and you can find Clara, please. She will be alone, and she will be angry, and she will blame you, because she is cleverer than she knows, and she will have worked out that you were involved, but she will have the wrong ending to the story. Tell I said she was the bravest person I knew, and look after her, you stubborn, impossible man. I mean that as a direct order." Clara sat on the floor of Julian's study with her brother's last letter in her hands, and stayed there until the candle went out entirely, until the cold came through the floor and settled into her bones without her noticing. She did not make a sound. She put both hands flat on the stone, and breathed the way she had trained herself to breathe when a thing was too large to respond to immediately. And she breathed, and stayed very still in the dark. It was not grief, exactly. She had been grieving for 2 years. This was something else, the specific vertigo of having the architecture of your certainty pulled out from under you, the sensation of a story you have been living inside, revealing itself to be a different story entirely. She understood now why Julian had not been able to tell anyone, why Arthur's name could not be cleared publicly while the real traitor still operated in the War Office. She understood, most devastatingly, that Julian had been carrying her brother's secret alone for 2 years, trying to find her in silence, walking behind his wall of controlled authority with the full weight of Arthur's death pressing on him, and had simply kept going. She crept back to her room and lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling until morning. Lord George Vance showed her, quite inadvertently, exactly where to direct the anger that was still burning cleanly in her chest. At the country house party Julian hosted 3 weeks later, Clara moved through it carefully under her false name, perpetually aware of the exact weight of the identity she was wearing. Julian's aunt, Lady Augusta, identified her as an anomaly within 10 minutes and pressed steadily on every uncertain seam. At dinner, Augusta said in a carrying voice that Miss West must share a passage of poetry for the table's entertainment, as she had apparently been claiming some literary background, and it would be so illuminating to hear evidence of it. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when a public shaming is being orchestrated. From the corner of her eye, Clara saw Julian's hand tighten on his wineglass. She lifted her head and recited 12 lines of Milton from memory, perfectly, looking at a point just above Augusta's left ear. When she finished, she took a small, deliberate sip of water and went back to her soup. But it was Lord George who made everything urgent. On the 3rd evening she returned to her room to find it ransacked, thoroughly, professionally, by someone who knew what they were looking for. The wardrobe displaced. The mattress turned. The loose floorboard lifted. Arthur's pocket watch was gone. On her pillow there was a paring knife with a thin dark line along the blade. She went to Julian that night and told him what she had found. She watched his face move quickly through several things. Fear, then, the controlled efficiency of a man who knows what to do with danger, and he said, very quietly, that she needed to trust him for 24 more hours. She said, "You keep asking me for trust you haven't explained how to give," he said, and she heard the full weight of 2 years in it. "I know. I'm sorry for that." At Lady Danbury's Mayfair ball, 3 days later, Clara found the watch. She saw it when Lord George drew it idly from his coat pocket near the side room where the card players had retired, turning it over in his fingers, with the proprietary ease of a man who does not expect to be challenged. She followed him into the side room. She waited until the card players moved on. Then she said his name. He turned. He looked at her. And then, because he was, fundamentally, the kind of man who believes he has already won, he smiled. He told her everything, not because he was careless, but because he was contemptuous. The pension Julian had been sending for 2 years had been very useful. Arthur had been an inconvenience who had solved himself. Clara had been a loose end that had conveniently frayed into poverty, without any additional effort on his part. He told her all of this with the watch still in his hand, flipping it between his fingers, and he smiled the whole time. Clara looked at him. She felt very clear. The way she had felt on the morning she buried her father, that crystalline stillness that precedes the moment when grief becomes something with direction. She said, "Thank you." George's smile changed slightly. She walked out of the side room and into the ballroom. She had a single moment to make a choice. She could leave. That was the rational course. Leave the ball, leave the city, write everything down and send it somewhere official. She had for 2 years been a person who survived by not drawing attention to herself. She was very tired of surviving. This is the moment, and I want you here for it. The music had already stopped by the time she walked back onto the floor. Julian had found her. He had been watching for her. She understood now, and he had her wrist, and his face was the face of a man trying to do the right thing and not yet knowing what the right thing was. The whole room was watching. She stopped pulling. She pulled her wrist free. She stepped backward onto the center of the floor, into the full reach of the candlelight. Her voice did not shake. She had not known before this moment whether it would. It did not. It rang out with the clarity of something held under pressure for too long, finally released. "Look at me, Your Grace. Look at the mud on my hem and the hunger in my bones. You offer me silken cages and quiet corners to hide your shame. But I am Arthur Vance's sister. My brother died with your name on his lips, fighting a treason born in this very room. I will not hide in the shadows while the monster who sold our soldiers' lives sips your champagne." The watch was in her hand. She had taken it back from George's coat pocket when she walked out of the side room. Old habits, quick fingers, one last time. She looked at it for a moment in her palm. 2 years. All the numbers on the floorboards. All the nights the cold came through the burlap, and she had held this one thing. She threw it. It caught the candlelight once, turning, and then it hit the marble floor and broke apart, the inner gears scattering across the polished surface in a small bright arc. The sound it made was very small in a very silent room. Lord George's face had lost all its colour. Julian looked at the broken watch on the floor. He stood perfectly still for 3 full seconds. She counted them, and she watched the ice that had been his expression since she had known him fracture down the centre, and kept fracturing until what was underneath was something so unguarded she had to look away. He drew his dress sword. He stepped in front of her, back to her, between her and his cousin and the gathering watchman, and he stood there with the quiet, absolute finality of a decision that cannot be unmade. In that breathless silence, the Tun learned that a duke's pride was nothing compared to the fury of a starving woman who had finally found her voice. Lord George was removed by War Office agents, who had been, it emerged, watching him for 6 weeks. The arrest was swift and public and irreversible. Julian's sword went back in its scabbard. The room began, cautiously, to breathe again. And then Julian turned and walked back across the ballroom floor and went to one knee on the marble among the scattered gears of Arthur's broken watch and began to pick them up. One by one. His gloved hands careful and deliberate, he gathered every piece. He cupped them in his palm and held them up to her. He did not say anything. He simply bowed his head. Clara stood in the centre of Lady Danbury's ballroom, in a borrowed gown with mud on the hem, and she took the broken pieces of her brother's watch from the Duke of Stirling's hands. Justice, when it finally comes, rarely arrives with trumpets. More often it comes quietly, the way winter ends. Not in a single transforming moment, but in the gradual accumulation of change, until one morning you look out and the frost is gone, and you did not notice exactly when it happened. Arthur Vance's name was cleared in the spring of 1819. A public statement acknowledged his service and restored the family's honour. The rectory in Wiltshire was returned to Clara. A small stone was placed in the churchyard beside the unmarked grave, with Arthur's name and his dates and one word, faithful. Clara stood at that grave for a long time. She had established a small sanctuary for impoverished women in the Clerkenwell district by then, a house with 2 rooms, a refuge of first resort, a place you could come without papers and without references, and without the requirement to explain yourself before you could come in from the cold. It was never finished. There were always more women. But it was real, and it was hers, and she walked through Mayfair to reach it sometimes on purpose, with her head up, just to feel the difference between walking those streets invisible and walking them known. Julian had resigned his War Office post in January. He did not replace the icy authority with anything immediately. For a few months he simply was, which was something he had not been in a very long time, and which Clara suspected was uncomfortable for him in the way that thawing is uncomfortable. The specific ache of circulation returning to something that has been numb. He reformed his estate management. He corresponded with tenant farmers. He learnt the names of the children on his grounds and was visibly uncertain about this knowledge, which she found, she could admit, completely endearing. He courted her properly. A man accustomed to commanding, waiting on permission, he brought her books she had mentioned once in passing, certain she had not noticed him noting it. He walked with her in the Wiltshire lanes, and carried things, and did not say much, and she talked, and he listened in the particular way of someone learning something they understand, they have needed to learn for a long time. She chose him when she chose him. This is important. It was not inevitable. It was a choice she made with the clear eyes of a woman who had spent 2 years understanding precisely what she could survive without, and who was now, very deliberately, choosing what she wanted. A silver pocket watch sat on the mantelpiece of the Wiltshire rectory, repaired, its case still bearing the faint marks of its shattering, its gears running true again. A craftsman in Cheapside had put it back together over 3 patient weeks. When Julian brought it to her, he said only that some things, repaired, run better for having been broken, and she looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed, which was a sound that surprised them both. On the stone terrace of the rectory, on a rainy April evening that smelled of mud and new grass and the beginnings of something, Julian drew the watch from his coat and opened it, and checked the time, and then closed it, and slid it into Clara's hand. And they walked inside together beneath a single warm cloak. It was still raining. They did not hide from it. Society builds its walls of pride and prejudice, believing the vulnerable can be swept away like dust beneath gilded rugs. But they forget that dignity cannot be starved out of a true heart, and justice, when it breaks through, can bring even the highest thrones to their knees. Thank you for listening to tonight's tale on Whispered Thrones. If Clara's quiet strength and Julian's earned redemption touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share this journey with another soul who believes in the power of truth. If you leave without subscribing tonight, I am afraid you owe me a favour, and a duke's debts are never easily repaid. Until the shadows whisper again, sleep well and remember your own worth.